Audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Good, good. Hi, my name is Ben, POI's True Voice. Happy to be in this round. Let me just set my timer. Starting my speech in three, two, one. Neither side of this debate is going to uphold status quo because on side government, there's a group of individuals who live with the knowledge that they've literally denied the world of valuable knowledge that makes them operate better in their lives. People will now have to live with a lie. There is something that changes on both sides, and we think that the change that happens on our side is the more valuable and the more important one. The first thing that I want to do then is to talk about why people become scientists in the first place. And note that even if this is not an actor motion, this shows the kind of moral obligations and the kind of moral standards that scientists set upon themselves, which brings weighs in to the kind of judgment that you have to make in this debate. Because often, being a scientist is not just about being smart, right? Often you want to advance human knowledge, and every moment that you advance human knowledge, you want everyone to know with it because of a lot of things. One, you discovering that evidence was probably a result of concerted actual effort that took you months or years as a scientist. For example, therefore, the only way that you see this venture is worth it is when you publicize that knowledge and when you leave that to the public to decide on what to do with that knowledge. But often, also more importantly, you also see a moral obligation to release things that you discover precisely because you know that that can be a stepping stone for a huge spectrum of possibilities that could be done. There could be more research, for example, on how the afterlife actually works. How can ghosts, for example, meaningfully behave based on how they behave as humans are valuable knowledge that we could live with, for example, as individuals. But more importantly, you find it morally reprehensible and morally evil to hide knowledge away from the world. Because even if it is an inconvenient truth, even if it is a truth that will set the world on fire, there is still a moral knowledge for scientists to forward the truth precisely because living in a lie and making the world live in a lie is not a viable alternative for you. The next thing that I want to do is talk about the deity because the deity did not discourage you from releasing that information to the public. In fact, the deity has given you a choice. All of this is to show that there's no compelling force for you to not do this right out of the onset. So your drive to release knowledge to the public is likely the one that's going to triumph. But I want to do some rebuttals then, because the first thing that Yago tells you at Prime Minister is that you make people move on better. But the response to that is quite simple. People do not move on our world when we do not know where people go. When we theorize on if our mom is actually in heaven or in hell or does not exist at all. It is that uncertainty that makes us panic. That doesn't make us want to move on from the idea that they could be in heaven, that they could be in hell, that they could be somewhere else around the world. The difference is, at least on our world, we know that for 30 straight days, they could be roaming this earth. They could still be living their life. They could still be protecting us, and you could still send your messages of love, and they would still be able to listen. This is the more comforting alternative that, in fact, pushes people to move on from their lives, especially after that hard cap of 30 days when you know that they no longer exist upon this earth. It is that very certainty that drives people to move on better. The next thing that they say is people become lazy, and I think this is just alluding to the kind of relationships that we form upon individuals. The first response to this is just people will still die. You don't want to make friends with a dead individual, and therefore you would still want to make social interactions with your friends, with your family, and with your loved ones when they are still alive, because that is when they can respond to you. That is when you know that they still exist, and that is when you know that they're still right there with you in that within same room. You do not know, for example, if people will roam the earth after they die. Therefore, you still want to make those connections. The last thing that I want to respond to is this idea on revenge and the idea of hauntings, right? Because I don't think people knowing that these hauntings exist is the tipping point for people to not be haunted. So in their world, there will still be hauntings. The ghosts will still literally come for their lives. The difference is just people do not know about it. The difference in our world then is quite simple. When you know about it, you know how to prepare for it, and you know how to deal with it. I think that's important because that makes people more rational and know, for example, how the world works around them. They're less likely to consult things like exorcism because they like to want to handle that themselves. But second is just you just know, for example, and you're able to prepare, for example, and even in fact anticipate the fact that the people that you punch, for example, in high school will haunt you in death. The first argument is quite simple. I want to talk about the idea of belief. Because they might say that belief is valid and we need to let people have beliefs. But beliefs only exist and beliefs are only valid when we do not know for sure. The difference is we do know for sure, right? Therefore, it is morally reprehensible for us to allow people to believe in outright lies and outright lack of, for example, further knowledge. That is not how humans operate. Belief only exists when there's complete uncertainty and we do not know how to operate with that. I'll take you.
Yeah, we know that, for instance, the world wasn't created by a giant rainbow snake. Do you think it's morally reprehensible for Indigenous groups to hold that belief?
But it's about what we know for sure, right? So we do not know if the world is truly created by a snake. But even in the off chance that it is, I don't think there's any harm to revealing to the world that we were created and we were born out of snakes. That's an irrelevant POI. Next argument then, on why more knowledge about the world is an inherent good that we ought to pursue and why it's morally reprehensible for us to withdraw any kind of information. The first thing is just it unlocks research on the idea of afterlife, and it unlocks research for other things that could have developed. So like I said earlier, this unlocks, for example, the capability for us to know about how people truly behave, how ghosts behave, what it truly means to be dead, and how it feels. This is additional sum of human knowledge that could trickle down to other aspects within our life and other resources in our life, and that could just make the innovation and the development of humans more certain and faster. Second is just this reduces the amount of uncertainty that individuals experience, and this is beneficial and true for 3 levels. One, people now know what happens after life, which erases the existential anxiety that burdens them. You now no longer know if you might end up in hell or you might end up in heaven, but you know for sure that, for example, you have 30 days after you die. This lack of existential dread means that people can actually truly focus on what is beyond them and what is around them, and I think that makes them make better decisions in life precisely because they're not held back by fears and anxieties. But second, it explains things like hauntings, for example, and exorcisms, and why they happen and how people can better prepare, for example, and how people could live with that very fact existing. So people will still be haunted. At least on our world, people know how to deal with it, and people know how to avoid it by being friendly with the people around you when they're still alive. And lastly, it's just this makes individuals more rational on net. So this isn't saying that religion will go away completely, but for the individuals who opt into things like spirituality and religion, at least they make more informed and rational choices about it, which means that they'll hold more reasonable beliefs in the event that they opt into things like spirituality. So that's less things like dogmatism, less things like extremism, precisely because we now know for sure what truly happens when people die, which is the main foundation of a lot of these things. All of this is to say that hiding this knowledge literally revokes the ability of humans to develop and to know what's happening around them. This is a moral harm in the event that you don't release this.
Okay.
Oh, there. Yeah, you can start when you're ready.
Okay. Give me a sec. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. The first thing that I would like to weigh is about grief or grieving. I think that it's assumptive from OG to assume that people can just move on because they can rationalize that you don't have any opportunity left, and therefore it's easy for you to prioritize other relationships. In fact, in most instances, when you face death and loss, the inherent response of people is to be regretful, to reminisce your experiences, and often go so far as to wishing, if only he were alive, I could have said I loved you. If only you were alive, I could have said I forgive you. Often, these actions that we weren't able to do is the one that haunts our lives. It is unclear why they move on their side. We say that if you know that at least he is a spirit, now you can find probably a spirit medium to talk, or just lull yourself that maybe he can hear you as a ghost while you speak your dying or your wishes to him. We say that on net, if we're talking about grief and this extreme suffering, we say that it's better resolved on our side precisely because we give people an opportunity to understand their grief, but also try to resolve it on their side. They're always left wondering. The first thing that I want to note is why is knowledge very important? I would note that understanding death and what happens to us after death is one of the most fundamental questions of human life. Often, the absence of any answers makes people fear death. They fear spirits and even uncertain if their lives are enough to overcome the coming nothingness of death. Why is therefore this good to spread? Notice that this was the largest argument that comes to you from Ben that was completely unresponded to you from OG. We say this is good because it allows more people to have an informed choice in how they live their lives, independent as to whether their lives will be spent goodly or not. So whether they do extreme acts like probably do drugs, or that whether they spend it goodly and go to and have a family. What we say is that the knowledge knowledge is necessary for them to make an informed choice on how they live their lives, regardless of how of the impacts of it. I noticed that right off the bat, this wins us the debate because in government, the destruction of the evidence means that no one on their side will ever make an informed choice on choice at all on scale. This means that no one at all can meaningfully arbitrate their choices inside government and therefore not meaningfully appreciate their lives precisely because they do not have the entire scope of the knowledge to how they live their lives. On their side, you doom these individuals to everlasting dread and anxiety precisely because no other answer can be formed with what happens to us after death. We say that you're likely force them to go towards religions and other fake cults and other ideologies that lulls them into fake beliefs that it's okay for you to die because maybe you'll go to heaven, because maybe you'll go to hell, because maybe you'll be reincarnated as a cockroach or something like that. We say that all of this means that all of these people are clinging towards a hope that's likely to that a hope that likely betrays them. We say that it's likely to be bad, to be bad inside government. What are we willing to take a trade? What are we willing to trade off? We are willing to trade off that perhaps this will break a lot of traditions of people and their preconceived norms and practices. However, we say that this is better because the first is it is unclear why changing formed norms are bad in the first place, insofar as norms often always evolve. The second is that we say that these norms and knowledge can often marry each other. So if people choose to opt into norms, even if they understand that they will become ghosts after they die, then it's fine because what we're saying is that what we're saying is that the provision of the knowledge actually expands your choice. So if you want to go and opt into a different norm rather than this, then it's all right. At least you know the consequences of that action. On their side, you don't know this at all. But secondly, right, they say that a lot of people are going to be paranoid. We think that this is just a short-term harms towards accepting it. It's likely a transition towards other norms in order to support this knowledge is going to happen. This is why their argument about spiritual business is good, because it comes from the demand to cope and understand these things. I would note that they assume that cults are always going to be bad. In fact, they'll probably still have an incentive to not be bad and stick with legitimized information because now there's an information or knowledge that affirms these kinds of things. In fact, the harms of cultists and spirit mediums becoming bad extremely is not exclusive, precisely because they are still part of the ideology that ghosts are real on their side and they're just evil precisely and they're just evil and radical on their side precisely because a lot of times they have no knowledge to like legitimize their acts. On their side, they are likely forced to create weird knowledges to just affirm that maybe Satan is on your shoulder or something like that. On our side, we don't have that because now we have a concrete knowledge to prove that these ghosts are actually real. On their side, the problem is that they prey in the most vulnerable as well. And often it happens in the fringes of society absent the knowledge. At least on our side, that a lot of mediums and shamans can be formed that we can arbitrate which is a good shaman or not just with the sheer amount of option on it. On their side, the only way you correct shamans on the fringes is when a lot of people have already been harmed. It is worse on their side because when people die and they are faced with the impending doom, we say that this is likely going to be with the impending doom that they become a ghost and will disappear. We say that you let them suffer and regret all the experiences and time that they lived. So this argument assumes now that when you have died and you do not know the knowledge that you will become a ghost, we think that you will suffer and regret your days within those 30 days that you are a ghost. On magnitude, this means that an individual will hate and regret his entire life, his identity, and all the choices he could have made if he knew this knowledge. This is 30 days of you being a ghost and just feeling extreme suffering that if only I could have known this, that probably I could have done something better. On net, this is a lot of people that died that will feel all of this suffering. In fact, we say as an extension that they're likely going to feel so remorseful and regretful that they don't know this knowledge, that they go out and inform their families and loved ones about this knowledge. So this looks like, for example, a lot of huntings and spirits and family feeling weird precisely because, as they say, it is unclear if they can touch physical things. So they likely do all things to create sensations to be seen. We think that this on net increases a lot of paranoia and fear on their side. So on our side, if paranoia and fear exists, it happens in the short term. On their side, it will remain forever because a lot of people will die and they will just be ghosts. This is also where I compare the weird argument about vengeance and a lot of people trying to hunt you. Because on their side, you are being hunted by ghosts, but you have no idea why you feel these ghosts or you feel these things because you don't understand it absent the knowledge. If probably there's a bad ghost and there's going to have a revenge on you, at least you're more prepared because you understand that they become ghosts and therefore you can probably shield yourself from this. So on net, government creates more suffering on the ground not only because they do not give choice to individuals and doom them towards anxiety, but for the people who die, they give them more suffering, not only because they feel regretful and remorseful, but secondly, creates more fear for the people in status quo because the ghosts take it on their hand to inform others. And this is also why it's better on our side. And if the scientists spread the knowledge instead of ghosts, precisely because they're human, so it's less creepy. But secondly, because as OG says, that they can be held accountable, they can be held accountable. And like Ben said, they often have the moral obligation to do this. At the end of this speech, it is clear. And if we talk about agency, if we talk about allowing grief to happen and just having more better relationships, it's better maximize with the knowledge. It's better maximize inside OO. CO can't just like rehash this.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that speech. I remind everybody to tell people what your POI preferences are so that they do know. And yeah, guess we can move on to the latter half of the debate, calling on MG. Here.
Well, and we'll just make sure that I can be heard, and I'll take POIs in the chat. Connor, she, her. When military medics walk onto battlefields and hold soldiers as they die, as the medic knows that person is going to die, when that soldier asks them, am I going to be okay? They say, yes, you are. Help is on the way. Just hang in there. I don't think that's a morally reprehensible lie that person has done. I think it is the greatest kindness and the greatest mercy that they could have done in that situation. Scientists destroying this information is the greatest kindness that they could do mankind. It is the single greatest mercy, because knowing this information breaks down the very social fabric across the world, which strips people of their ability to define their own experiences through religion and through culture. And it instills in every single person who will die one day an overwhelming fear of death and of mourning of their own death and of their loved one's death. Let's firstly explain why this ruins religion, and why that is on its own a debate-winning benefit the harm for clothing government. A couple of premises at the start of this extension. The first is that many religious beliefs are based on premises that are just shredded by this revelation, like where we go when we die, but importantly, things like connection to ancestors, and that those people are still there and still watching over you, provides people a great deal of comfort. For instance, even that you will be reincarnated in some of the many large religions in the world, like Hinduism. And that means that those premises are just shredded by this revelation. But even if you don't believe that those premises are inherently shredded, presumably scientists also have to reveal the existence of this deity, which just kind of like completely destroys the notion that there's an Abrahamic God or that there are many gods or polytheism. The next set of claims here is just to say that religion is important. I know religion gets a bit of a bad rap in debating, but it is actually a good thing for most people. First is that it helps people understand more than just their death. It helps them understand moral questions. It helps them understand existential questions as people access self-actualization. It's very important. The second thing to say is that just a simple observation that most people in the world are religious, or at the very least are not entirely atheistic. We are talking about literally billions of people who hold religious beliefs that are shredded here. It is the revealed preference of most of the world, even if it is not your revealed preference. And thirdly, it is the basis of culture and identity. It is firstly how groups bind together over time and during hardship. When people gather together to break bread for Seder in the face of a genocide, that is what binds that group together. It is how people, secondly, how people have a high overlap with ethnicity or cultural and linguistic groups that they're able to pass on through time and pass on those traditions and those identities. What happens when you reveal this information? The first thing that happens is that billions of people wake up on literally a random morning to hear that what they've been living through for their life is a lie. What people in their families have lived for and have in many instances died for is a lie, is a factual untruth. They are subject to the very same rhetoric of opening opposition, which is shameful, that they are ridiculous for believing a mistruth, that they cannot understand the way that the world really is. Second thing that happens is you remove all impetus for the protection of religious practices the world over for the very reasons identified by opening opposition. We know that, for instance, Allah does not exist and therefore does not ask women in France to wear the burqa. So there is no impetus to protect that, or to say, have people have halal food or kosher food or any of those religious practices, or the protection of, for instance, more perniciously, religious and indigenous minorities that exist within countries. When indigenous people don't want their sacred sites bulldozed, it's far easier now to suggest that actually those sites are not sacred at all because that God isn't isn't real, that creation myth isn't real. Thirdly, in the non-mainstream, because this debate also applies there, where people do not believe this message, you incur a massive increase in religious radicalization, where people completely reject the rest of the mainstream of the world. And that is like the worst set of harms that people engage in the name of religion. It looks like cults, it looks like extremism. Second piece of extension is explaining why this creates another independently debate winning overwhelming fear of death and mourning. But first, I'll take closing if they have one. 3, 2, 1. Okay, closing, go.
Yeah, thank you. So why will religious people believe these scientists if it is a belief that they have been
Okay, most religious people are in the mainstream. The information slide literally says that this will be believed by people in the mainstream, that the evidence is so irrefutable that it will be believed. Like, that is just a thing that we're allowed to assume in the debate. I explain why religious radicals will not believe that and will incur a separate, a distinct set of harms. But people in the mainstream, of which the vast majority of religious people are numerically and mathematically, will believe this, and it will shred them and destroy their lives in many instances. Secondly, then, on the overwhelming fear of death and mourning, this inflicts, I think, the worst kind of psychological horror imaginable on everybody, because everybody will die and everybody knows that they will die. This is not just the paranoia that OG describes, wondering if your dead relative is still with you, wondering what you could have done better, all of those kinds of things, for a few reasons. The first is we explain that everybody fears death way more because, firstly, they know that they will completely stop existing. It's not a question of, I will gently go to sleep in old age and then who knows what happens, and I can take comfort in defining my own experience for myself. They know that they will have a 30-day purgatory where they're trapped on this earth and they cannot do anything about it, and they will stop existing at the definitive end of that time period, because secondly, they know with certainty when that will happen. They thirdly know that they will have no control over anything that happens during that time, because most people have not actually experienced like a ghost haunting that was super interventionist. They know that, for instance, even if they think spirits exist or have previously thought that spirits existed, don't have substantial control over the world, know that they will be walking around their home, their childhood home, their school, around their family, and know that they will not be able to access those people at all, that they will scream and cry, that they are afraid of what is going to happen to them, and that the loved ones in their life will not hear them and will not understand, will not react, and will not respond. That is horrible. And they fourthly know that they'll have to watch the awful fallout of their death, their parents be devastated that they died in a car crash, their children fight over their will and destroy and rip apart the fabric of those families. They know that they will watch that. They secondly, everyone will fear the death of other people way more, not just because, again, of the paranoia that opening government describes, but firstly, because it takes about 2 seconds during prep to realize what psychological horror this process would be. So people can appreciate that if they have a loved one that is close to death or even just older than them, like people fearing their parents' deaths in a tremendous amount, because they know that this is what will happen. They worry that their mother, who's died of cancer, will be sitting across from them in their living room as they desperately cling to the mourning of her death, try to cling to some sort of meaning, and that she could be screaming in their face and they will not hear her, they will not understand her, they will not be able to touch her, to hold her, to comfort her. It's the worst kind of horror imaginable. The second reason is that people will mourn people twice over. You will sit through the worst 30 days of your life after the death of your best friend, knowing that they are still there, but in a few days they will be gone forever. There is no certainty that they will be around anymore. Why does this not happen if you don't know? The first is that when you experience this process and you didn't know it was previously going to happen, it reframes your entire experience of it. You might, for instance, think that you're in a bit of a fever dream. You might, for instance, think that you're in the process to the afterlife that you already believed in, and are more likely to have a positive experience out of that if you do not know. But secondly, you just also don't know that you're going to immediately disappear. Like, you don't actually know that you're going to stop existing at the end of that period, which is like the thing that is, I think, of most horror for the majority of people. This is the greatest mercy that these scientists could afford on the world. Everybody is going to die. The majority of people are religious. Closing government affects the greatest number of people. They are affected profoundly. They are affected profoundly. You must not reveal this information.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on member of opposition. Here.
Can I be heard?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I want to firstly kick up closing government extension first. They say that sharing this information is going to ruin religion because you shred the premise of religious belief. I have 3 responses to this. Firstly, note that the existence of a ghost for 30 days is not contradictory to many religious beliefs. So this discovery basically says that you're going to become ghost for 30 days on Earth, and then you cease to exist from Earth later on. And what that means is that you can still justify the existence of afterlife, that you cease to exist from this planet, but that does not mean that you're not going to exist in the afterlife. There's heaven out there and hell out there. But also at the same time, things like reincarnation in Buddhism can also be justified because you cease to exist from the earth as you are, but you might be reincarnated to a bear or to an insect in the future. You just don't know it. You can't just figure it out, right? Like, it is not in any way contradictory to the religious belief of many religions. They asserted it, and it's too late for government whip to mechanize this. Secondly, note that the way that this information is going to be disseminated to the public is vis-a-vis media. And note that the media company obviously have an incentive to disseminate this information in carefully selected way, insofar as they want to avoid backlash from like religious communities. They don't want like, the media companies to be like, a lot of religious people come and then like sort of, put fire onto the building of the media company, for example. Like, you don't want to offend people. That's why you're going to do it in carefully selected manner. It is very unlikely they're going to shred the very premise of religious belief. But finally, even if it does, religion is flexible. Note that the religious belief have historically changed over time and is likely going to, precisely because a lot of the religious text, for example, is thick. You can easily find contradiction in Bible, for example, or that the multiple different interpretation of the God exists to begin with. That's why religion can adjust accordingly. But we'd also point out that the belief of the ghost is not the central part of any religion. I've never heard any religion that centers around the existence of ghosts. If they can prove that, sure. First extension, we're going to prove that the hiding about this fact is going to substantially harm psychologically and emotionally the scientists in question. I know this sounds a little bit similar to opening up, but I'll differentiate them later on. There are three reasons. Firstly, know that carrying a secret in your heart is likely going to be immense amount of trauma. And it's not just any secret. You're hiding about a fundamental question in life of what happens after you die. And you can't tell this to anyone. And this is very important because empirically speaking, we know that human beings are really bad at lying. Like, lying to your partner about you cheating obviously makes utilitarian sense. Like, it's obviously better for you not to reveal anything about it. But many people would still choose to come forward because lying to people who are important to you, who are close to you in life, it's something that is fundamentally just emotionally taxing things. But even if you come forward and tell about this truth, no one's going to believe you because you destroy the evidence. So you feel the sense of loneliness. You feel like you're the only pawn in the universe, that no one understands you. That's an immense amount of psychological harm. But secondly, note that this destroying of evidence is an irreversible action. You're going to constantly wonder what would have happened if I had come forward and shared the evidence. Would I have not experienced the current emotional harm? Would I have made the world better? The thing to note that here is that right now, the point you have evidence, you do not know what the social implication of you revealing evidence is. Like, all the Gov team talks about, oh, you being able to move on better, or you being able to ruin religion, but like, that's all speculative. Like, we do not know what happens, and that's precisely the point. You're going to constantly wonder what would have happened, and whether or not I could have lived a better life, whether or not I would have saved a lot of people from, like, living in a lie, for example. That is a very important thing in this debate. But finally, we will note that you're under constant amount of guilt because you're going to constantly see a subsequent after your life, like seeing others believing that either ghost doesn't exist or believe that the ghost exists forever. So you attend your friends, your friends are going to talk about how, you're like, the ghost doesn't exist, or like how your father, like, who died a year ago, is up there, when in fact it is clearly not up there, right? The thing to note about here is that you're going to constantly feel guilty about not being able to tell about it, not being able to disclose it to the world. What is the consequence? And we want to note that people own closest obligation to themselves. People have the right to be selfish, even if there's some kind of social ramification. And the reason for this is twofold. One, people have closest proximity to themselves. So in the same way that if you have like a family member and a stranger drowning in the river, you would obviously have a moral obligation to save your family member. And the extension of that is that because you're the closest person to yourself, you owe greatest level of moral obligation to yourself. Secondly, instrumentalizing yourself to benefit others is fundamentally wrong, in the same way that killing me to save 5 other people to extract organs from me is something that is fundamentally morally wrong. What it proves is that even if there are some type of social harms that accrue to other external actors, we should have the right to be selfish. We should have the right to care about our own emotional well-being. Weighing wise, why does this matter? Firstly, I want to weigh against opening opposition. Opening opposition principle is not fully proven, or assumes that truth is the only thing that the scientists care about. Clearly not the case, right? Intuitive sense, like research that proves certain ethnic group has high or less IQ compared to others is clearly banned, and you cannot disclose that sort of information under the status quo. It is very unclear why science leads to the absolute truth. It is very unclear, and they never proved it. They just asserted it is the case. Secondly, note that our argument supersedes their claim because primary objective opening opposition is the belief that you have as a scientist, and our claim is that as a human, you are going to feel immense amount of emotional trauma of not being able to disclose this. I'll take opening government.
This is not an actor motion, but even then, why can't scientists just feel good for not putting people in trauma?
Yeah, the thing is just that this is not an actor motion. That's why I'm saying that these scientists have an obligation to prioritize themselves, and that's why this motion falls. On opening government and closing governments about the moving on stuff, right? Like, I just want to point out all of those things are heavily speculative because everyone grieves in subjective and different ways. So it's very unclear what opening government and closing government knows how people are going to grieve either ways. By contrast, the impact that we told you is just more proximately felt as well as more certain under our side of the house. On closure, I want to point out that we're going to flip the case of closure and explain why we get much better closure on our side of the house. Because when people often lose their loved one, they lose their loved one suddenly. So, car accident, disease, war, or poverty, things like that. And the thing to note about is that you obviously need a transition time because oftentimes in times of grief, right after your loved one died, you're obviously irrational, that you oftentimes cry all day. You just like constrain yourself into a room and then like not being able to do anything. But the thing to note about here is that the belief and the certain belief in the ghost that in the form of your deceased husband, for example, is something that allows you to make a rational choice in the interim period. Why is this the case? The first thing is that now you have a reason to live tomorrow because your husband or is looking at you, watching over you. You now have an incentive to do things like hold funeral that your husband exactly wanted. For example, you have an incentive to tailor to that because the person is seeing you, looking at you. You have an incentive to at least treat you, and that's very important because this is for 30 days, and for first 30 days is very important for you to be able to get used to the fact that you lost the important person in your life, which is something that you uniquely have access to when we have the confirmation on our side of the house. Very proud to stand on closing off.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on Gov Whip to close the debate for the Gov Bench. You're here.
POIs in the chat, please. In this speech, I'm going to talk about the two different ways in which CG wins this debate. I'm first going to talk about how this destroys belief systems, and I'm secondly going to talk about how this destroys the ways in which people's lives, with emphasis on the first because belief systems are so deeply important. What do we hear from the rest of the debate on belief systems? Opening half talks about how the insertion of ghosts into your current belief systems can have a slew of effects, but mainly they talk about things about how hard it is for you to grieve and move on from death, and they secondly talk about whether shamans are going to scam you. All of these claims are of relatively low impact from our opening half for two reasons. Firstly, because grieving happens for a finite amount of time, and not every single person grieves. It is something that is incredibly superfluous across individuals, and that does not affect everybody equally. Some people barely grieve, some people grieve a lot. It also happens for a finite amount of time, as I mentioned earlier, so this is not something that's particularly high impact. People will get over things eventually. In terms of shamans, I would say this just like plausibly sounds a little bit silly, because not everybody purchases shamans. They're expensive, but also maybe people just want to be blissfully ignorant. But also, it's not even clear from anybody in this debate that empowering shamans is necessarily even a harm. Maybe shamans give people comfort by allowing them to engage with the people who they wanted to engage with regardless. Our extension here is far higher impact. What do we tell you then on the destruction of belief systems? We tell you that we destroy religious systems as we know. Why? 3 reasons. Firstly, we tell you that this absolutely destroys the idea of an afterlife because you know that after 30 days, you're gone forever. You cease to exist as per the info slide. Secondly, this destroys the idea that any religions have, particularly polytheistic religions, have about a connection to an ancestor and about rebirth. That is something that cannot be consistent with you having ghosts in your life because those are things that require those ghosts to continue to exist in various cycles. Finally, though, and very importantly, and I think most damning for this side opposition, is that this reveals that there is a deity because scientists have to back up their discovery and they have to say it has been confirmed to me by a deity that this is true. You cannot just cite nothing. You have to confirm that there is a certain deity, which means that that all the world now has to believe that there is one person who holds all the power and who holds all knowledge and who is omnipresent. And that is particularly harmful for many religions because many religions that have Abrahamic or polytheistic deities are not compatible with this. What are the implications of this? They are threefold. Firstly, it means that a huge amount of people lose meaning in their lives. Secondly, it means that this removes the legitimacy of minority religions because you can no longer do things like protect indigenous sites on the basis that this actually might hold value to certain people or protect the rights of people to do things like wear burqas. But finally, we explain that this increases religious radicalism because it's going to lead to things like terrorism and rioting to the extent that people now have to and conceptualize with religion in this way. I think this is an absolutely debate-winning claim. I'm now going to deal with the responses that we hear from both OO and CO, all of which are pretty pithy. What does OO say? They say that actually knowledge about ghosts increases your agency because people now have more of an informed choice about their belief systems. 2 responses. Firstly, it is absolutely principally abhorrent to say that certain religions are not legitimate to believe in because certain religions that, even though they might not hold systems of belief that are necessarily, that they fully believe in, they still should have some sort of informed choice or some sort of right to pursue whatever they have culturally done, even though they might not believe that to be true. But secondly, I would suggest that there is not an informed choice about religion under side opposition. There is simply one choice. Because as we talked about earlier, you have to believe that the fact that there is one deity and there is one correct way of conceptualizing that afterlife because everyone in the mainstream believes it. So you have to coalesce around one religious identity. You cannot have multiple because there is only one effective choice on how the afterlife works. The second response that we hear is from CO when they point out in a POI that, well, if religious people are so passionate about their beliefs, why would they abandon them easily? But as we know empirically by the info slide, the sort of mainstream believes this, and it's particularly hard to convince that mainstream when they know for a fact that this is something that is true. They will not let go of their religious beliefs, and I'll touch on to that a little bit later. The next response we hear is from CO. They say that ghosts are not inconsistent with many religions, and that ghosts can be sort of worked into these religious texts. 4 responses. Firstly, the first two are with regards to the info slide. This topic inherently reveals the existence of one deity, which means that there is necessarily a reveal of a singular truth that has to be inconsistent with other religions. Secondly, the info slide says cease to exist. If you're debating in good faith, this means cease to exist in all forms. You cannot continue to exist in another form that has not been identified by the info slide. I challenge our bench to engage in good faith debating. Thirdly, though, this conception of an afterlife is contrary to all other existing conceptions, such as the polytheistic religions I've talked about earlier. But fourthly, even if religions can try to work this in, and even if you believe the op bench best case that it is still compatible with some ways, or that religious texts can be, retrospectively altered or changed in certain ways to make that people believe in those sorts of things, I don't think this sort of reworking is something that's actually particularly convincing to individuals because these individuals have been told that this is a mainstream truth. I don't think that you can, go ahead and you just very easily tell people, no, that you should change the way in which you've conceptualized of these religious texts for your whole life now. I don't think that's a particularly easy thing to convince people of. So maybe, the most religious people will still believe in their religions, but the people who are casually religious, like me, will not believe in that sort of thing because they know that that is something that is an untruth. Before I move on to the last response that we hear and explain why this is debate-winning opening.
Your debate-winning analysis is literally resolved by the info slide. If the evidence is so compelling and undeniable for individuals, then what's the problem of people shifting their belief systems?
The problem with shifting their belief systems is that it causes immense agony for people in the status quo. Those people have their lives uprooted. A lot of religious institutions are uprooted. For example, you can no longer have things like religious schools. A lot of people are then convinced that their cultures are illegitimate because a lot of cultures are based on religions. This is all in Connor's speech. I don't need to explain to you why religion is good. The final thing that we hear is from CEO when they say that the media is likely to do this in a particularly sensitive way, but it doesn't matter how it's conveyed. It's about the subject matter of what is conveyed. Even if the media does this in a way that is not, hugely explosive and sensationalistic, which I posit it probably will be, that does not matter because what they have said is so abhorrent. This is debate winning for two reasons. Firstly, because it affects almost all people, it affects billions of people, but even if it doesn't affect everyone, it still affects the millions and millions of people that are not very radically religious and will not still believe in this. Secondly, though, we explained to you that it affects the most vulnerable groups in society because those are the people that are likely to have their cultural values erased. Now let's talk about how people live their lives. Noting that opening half talks about the experiences after death, we talk when how you're going to be paranoid about that. We explain to you why you're actually likely to fear death to a far greater extent, and that affects every single person for the entirety of their lives, because you fear those 30 days because you're going to have to go through absolute agony and relive your life. I just want to weigh this against the contributions that we get from all of Offbench, from which CEO derives some OO about the scientist extension. Obviously, that is a very small group, and their integrity and their beliefs are not as important as literally everybody else in the world that is affected by this. So you ought not credit that as being something that is particularly compelling in this debate, because we explain to you that people's entire belief systems are destroyed and they lose all connection to culture, all connection to land. That is why CG so clearly takes this.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on the last speaker for today's debate, calling on Op-Whip. Here.
Okay, POIs in the chat, please. Okay, so starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first intuition I want to start my speech with is that religion, as with science, emerges from uncertainty, or the anxiety that entails uncertainty, which is to say that everything apart from the discovery itself, that you roam for 30 days and then you disappear, is uncertain. For example, the questions like, is this the only deity that exists? Or the question about what happens in afterlife just remains uncertain. And this is clear from the motion clarification, in which we say that whether the existence of afterlife is erased or not is completely up to the debate. We will prove to you from closing opposition why the existence of afterlife is probably still going to remain contested in our World 2, therefore completely kicking out closing government out of this debate. Okay, so bench by bench comparison, starting with closing government. The biggest material coming out of closing government is that it destroys religion, and then all the other big impacts that follow. I think that there are multiple reasons to believe why this is completely unrealistic. A is that I think that deeply religious people are probably not going to believe this. And this is especially critical because closing government themselves admit that some people will not believe it, that they will radicalize and they become extremely radical, which is an extremely convenient characterization to begin with. They say that the mainstream will believe it, but probably the mainstream is probably like atheist, or even if they're not atheists, they are likely to be moderately religious. We think these people are, which consists of the vast majority of the population, are not likely to be impacted by this thing to begin with, because this is not the belief that you had been living your whole life on, which is not the characterization of moderate people, moderately religious people, or atheist people. The people who are most damaged, as the characterization of closing government, are the people who are the most radical, or the people who have extremely deep faith. And what we would say here is that these people are not going to be impacted by this discovery, because the second thing to note here is that people will believe what they want to believe, as sort of like self-defense mechanisms. So if they really believe in that religion to the extent that it's going to nullify the complete meaning of your life, we think this is at the point where this sort of self-defense mechanism kicks in. What we would say here is that this is probably not the mainstream of people. We would say that these people would not believe to begin with. But C, I think that it's, as our member speaker quite clearly points out, it's not contrary to begin with. There is room for speculation. So I'm really not clear why closing government is still relevant in this debate. Okay. And finally, the second thing I want to talk about closing government is about giving people mercy and principle of not knowing, etc. if you buy all of the rebuttals that I already provided, this sort of, giving people mercy, etc., can completely exist on our side of the house. But secondly, what I would say is that this is, although beautifully packaged, is ultimately predicated on opening government about how they are better able to, seek comfort in government side of the world. At the point where we proved to you from member speaker as to why comfort is more likely to exist, closure is more likely to exist on our side of the house, we also beat closing government on this grounds. Okay, opening government. Mainly three things they came up with. First is that people can, one of the biggest premise of opening government is that people can freely pick and choose what they want to believe as if it was from a menu on a restaurant. We don't think this is realistic for a couple of reasons. A is that religion is often imposed on you regardless of whether of your choice. For example, religion is inherited through your family, or it's like imposed on you by your community. Like, for example, everyone around you believes in this religion, or, it starts from like sort of, half indoctrination that happens through education, etc. But B, I think that even if it was not imposed on you, and I think that all beliefs, I think that you will necessarily have to, face a significant degree of doubt on government side of the house, which is to say that you are the only person that is responsible for the choice of the religion that you believe in, which is to say that you have to continually doubt whether your choice was right, or on this choice that you solely made on your own. And this is especially true because all religions are equally compelling either way, but also the fact that there's emergence of science which says that and some atheists trying to attempt to deny religion through scientific religion, etc., necessarily means that you're not likely to be able to opt into a belief that you can find comfort in. We think this is a problem that we solve on our side of the house. I will prove to you that certainty of belief still exists on our side of the house. Second thing they say is about we can cope with certainty more. I think that this is pretty largely speculative, as we told you from member speaker. We think on our side too, we can also have equal certainty. The fact that the ghost will be around for like 30 days, etc., you can move on, or at best it's probably a speculative impact in the government counterfactual. The third thing about capitalization, I'm happy to gang up with CG on this point and say that this is probably not a huge issue. Like people who want to be Sherman, who do these businesses, are probably going to exist on both sides of the house anyway. So I'm not sure why this is going to be a huge impact. And if just people believe that that's the right thing, even if they suffer economically, it's not necessarily proven why that is actually a huge thing or something that is extremely detrimental. Before moving on to opening opposition comparison, I'll take OG.
We explained that shamans are not that shamans are bad because they get money, but they capitalize on your vulnerability and make you feel further sad because they want to earn more money and hence like inflicting harm on these individuals.
So if they don't provide reassurance to these people, I'm not sure how their business model works to begin with. If this is a shaman that tries to continually, make you anxious, this is at the point where your business model fails. Rather, the more realistic characterization is a model in which the clients, after they, consulted the shaman, they feel that they were actually reassured that, your loved ones who passed away are actually there or they're safe, etc. And that leads to them thinking that I want to get more reassurance from this person. We don't think this is the realistic characterization of Shermans. Okay, finally, opening opposition. There are mainly two problems. The first is that they have a huge scattershot of impacts. For example, science is emotions, or more knowledge is good, it leads to innovation, existential threat is going to disappear, etc. Although I would say that they are not independently established robustly, which we do in the second half of our member speech, I would say that the second problem is that at best these impacts regarding what people out in the public would feel is at best speculative, because people believe in so many religions, people live in so many different circumstances. In government counterfactual, you can there are things that are certain on government counterfactual. There are things that are also uncertain in government counterfactual. For example, you don't know which belief to opt into, etc. So we think that comparatively speaking, we do not suffer these problems because number one, we proved to you the most certain impacts and most robustly about how scientists feeling extreme guilt and why they have the right to actually, choose to like self-defense themselves. But secondly, I think that we mechanize more about how opening opposition certainty exists and the emotional security and closure. So I think that on those grounds, please vote closing opposition.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for that speech. That concludes our round. You may now virtually cross the house. And I guess me and the other panelists can just simply take a breakout room. So maybe you can just go to A01.